Hi, thank you for joining us for a report from the intersection of engineering education and organizational science. Our innovative practice paper explores the potential of adapting and implementing established best practices from organizational science to strengthen strategic change initiatives in engineering education. I'm Jesse Pappas, and my co-author for this paper is Olga Parakos. We're from the Department of Engineering at Wake Forest University. Our mission is to educate the whole engineer. And to do so, we're seeking to create a program that is both agile and change adept. This project is about getting better at strategic change and intentionally creating the social and academic cultures that our students deserve. After a brief introduction and rationale, I will summarize best practices for strategic change from organizational science, then briefly review the current state of strategic change in the engineering education literature. I will then present 6 new principles of good practice for organizational change in engineering education and wrap up by touching on limitations and next steps. Transforming organizational culture has been a priority in engineering education for going on 4 decades now. But so far, systemic change has not come easily, and some longstanding goals remain elusive. Stagnant graduation and industry participation rates for women and minorities indicate that we have not yet established cultures of inclusion at many of our universities. Continued difficulty closing the research to practice gap in engineering classrooms points to departmental cultures that are either resistant to or unprepared for academic culture change. Why, with some notable exceptions, has cultural change progressed so slowly? Are our organizations by nature resistant to change? Or could our interventional methodologies be improved? How much do we really know about planning and managing cultural change? And could best practices from organizational science help catalyze the transformations we seek? It may come as no surprise that there is a longstanding sense of frustration among some leaders in our community. 20 years ago, Baba and Pulowski wrote, "While engineering education scholars and industry leaders agree that cultural transformation is called for, there is neither widespread understanding nor agreement about how to change culture. Some worry that this mission is truly impossible. Certainly, it is difficult to change any academic culture, since one of academia's characteristics is conservatism and a generally high level of resistance to change." In the introduction to his recently released book on coping with accelerating change in engineering education, Aldrich Kamp characterized the current state of affairs in similar terms. "I have noticed a scary widening gap between the visionaries and thought leaders on one side and the majority of academic staff, including higher education management, on the other side. There is so much skepticism to upgrade programs that have survived unaltered for decades. There is so much complacency with the status quo." In summary, strategic change is imperative, but elusive, and best practices for transforming higher education cultures have not yet been established. However, best practices in this domain do exist across campus in business and psychology programs. So, is it time for engineering education to meet organizational science? Our paper explores this potentiality. Now, a brief overview of best practices for strategic change from organizational science. In 1986, Cotter integrated the results of hundreds of change management initiatives across various industries to derive an 8-step process for leading change. This model is widely recognized as a seminal work and has been used to guide hundreds, if not thousands, of professional strategic change initiatives. Cotter's model has also been implemented successfully in higher education environments, including STEM programs. Cotter's 8 steps for leading change include: 1, establishing a sense of urgency; 2, forming a powerful guiding coalition; 3, creating a vision for change; 4, communicating this vision effectively; 5, removing obstacles to empower broad-based action; 6, generating short-term wins; 7, consolidating and building on these wins; and finally, institutionalizing the desired change. Cotter's model remained the leading standard of practice for more than 2 decades. Then, in 2018, 3 leading organizational scientists published a comprehensive review and synthesis of the empirical literature on managing organizational change that included numerous revisions and updates to Cotter's model. Among the most significant innovations are the addition of functional diagnosis, an interventional approach, and increased flexibility. While Cotter insisted that all 8 steps be present and completed in sequential order, the new model comes with no such requirement. A small body of work investigating organizational change within engineering programs has emerged since the turn of the century. Belmoria and Lang synthesized outcomes from advanced initiatives at 19 universities into a framework for organizational change intended to serve as a template for universities seeking cultural transformation. Finelli and colleagues' work on managing organizational change to improve student learning and bridge the research to practice gap proposes a 4-step model for changing organizational culture. Overall, a strong core of conceptual knowledge and well-founded but relatively general recommendations for strategic change have been established in engineering education. However, 2 primary areas of need remain, including 1, unification and clarity among existing recommendations in the engineering education literature, and 2, the identification of additional and more specific practices to enable strategic interventions. In developing principles of good practice for managing strategic change, we sought to preserve core directives from organizational science while also allowing insights from the engineering education literature to guide our formulation process. Using this strategy, our research team synthesized Cotter's 8 steps, Stout and Rousseau and de Crémer's 10 practices, and published work from engineering educators. The result was 6 practical principles for managing strategic change in engineering education. They include 1, functional diagnosis, 2, a compelling vision, 3, an interventional design, 4, distributed implementation, 5, agile management, and 6, institutional adoption. For each of these 6 principles, I will display the source materials and briefly describe the core tenets. The first principle is functional diagnosis. A clear understanding of how targeted problems are manifest within organizational culture is critical to subsequent interventional design and implementation. This involves studying the organization from multiple perspectives. Assessing the organization's readiness for change is also important. Sometimes functional diagnosis reveals alternate paths or embedded solutions that negate the need to engage the interventional processes defined in principles 2 through 6. As philosophers have said in many ways, sometimes the solution lies within understanding the problem itself. The second principle of good practice is developing and communicating a compelling vision. The engineering education literature is rife with visions of change, but how exactly should such visions be formulated and communicated within academic programs to foment change? This is rarely addressed. In his more recent work, Cotter writes that vision can translate opportunity into action. An effective vision creates a sense of urgency that appeals to a diversity of stakeholders. Principle number 3 is interventional design. Strategic change requires strategic action, and such action should be guided by evidence-based practice. Our informal review of nearly 40 years of engineering education literature on culture change revealed that 1, published initiatives are more likely to be theoretical or conceptual than interventional, and 2, there is a lack of consensus around good interventional practice. Organizational research highlights the importance of interventions that develop change-related skills, offer rewards and incentives to motivate change, and provide opportunities to practice change activities in supportive environments. The fourth principle of good practice is distributed implementation. This principle encompasses multi-level practices that share the common purpose of helping change spread through an organization. Interventions should be driven by a distributed implementation strategy that features multiple sources of leadership working together as an empowered network. Embedded social networks also play an important and often overlooked role in influencing organizational change. Change agent effectiveness is derived from a combination of individual ability and network connections. Interventional practices should be tailored for maximum impact at multiple organizational levels. Principle number 5, agile management. Agile approaches to project management emphasize segmentation, iteration, flexibility, formative assessment, and periodic goal revision. This approach effectively unites several best practices for managing strategic change in the organizational and engineering education literature. Agile methodologies are becoming increasingly popular in engineering education, so for some teams, using agile strategies to manage strategic change may be a natural progression. And finally, The sixth principle of good practice for managing strategic change in engineering education is institutional adoption. Sustainable change requires the integration of new values, expectations, and practices into broader organizational systems. You will know change has been institutionalized when it is no longer perceived as change because it has become a part of your organizational culture. Please refer to our paper for much more detail on each of these principles. Engineering education and organizational science have rarely been studied in concert. The present work is intended to expose potential benefits of this interdisciplinary collaboration within the domain of strategic change. We have taken care to base our recommendations on the collected outcomes of published efforts, but until these principles are tested in engineering education contexts, they're really still just ideas. Further, while the 6 principles are informed by engineering education research, they're predominantly based on the results of professional practice. Best practices for strategic change within academic environments may diverge in important ways. Research that evaluates the utility of the 6 principles is needed to determine their practical value. For instance, our team is currently conducting a formal methodological analysis of published strategic change initiatives within engineering education to gain practical insight into common challenges, strategies, and outcomes among theoretical and interventional projects. Through broad-based community investigation, implementation, and refinement of best practices for strategic change, we will be able to transform even the most durable organizational cultures. Thank you.